The United States and Saudi Arabia at odds. What is the future of the strategic partnership between these two countries? Hello, I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C., and this is The Heat. United States President Barack Obama traveled to Saudi Arabia about 2 weeks ago, a visit widely seen as important for bolstering strained relations between the two countries. Here now to discuss this relationship, CCTV's Nathan King. And Nathan, these two countries are close allies.
Yeah.
Why are ties so strained right now?
Well, remember, when you go back to the founding of the alliance during the Second World War, FDR and the Saudis basically came to a deal over security for Saudi Arabia in exchange for access to the oil markets. Now, what's been going on is the US now very much not so dependent on Saudi oil with the fracking boom. In fact, only 11% of its oil comes from Saudi Arabia. But it's also much more strategic. Iran, in short, essentially the deal over Iran's controversial nuclear program and bringing back Iran into the community of nations has really irked the Saudis. Saudi Arabia, of course, has a rivalry with Iran in the greater Middle East. They do not get on, one being, of course, Sunni, one being Shia, and they are seeing Washington, whether it's true or not, shift towards Tehran in terms of away from Riyadh, and that worries them as well. And there are deep differences over also regional conflicts, including Syria, of course, and the civil war in Yemen as well. So these two allies that have seen eye to eye when it comes to the Middle East peace process, when it comes to the world's oil markets, when it comes to dealing with terrorism, are now at odds on nearly all of them.
And Nathan, President Obama recently traveled to Saudi Arabia, as I mentioned. What was the point of that visit? Was he going there to smooth over ruffled feathers?
Absolutely, and from the outset, the signalling, the protocol, if you like, was not good. He was actually met at the airport by the governor of Riyadh, a very important man, but not a member of the close inner circle of the royal family. And relations have been a big problem. They was there under the auspices of the GCC, the Gulf Cooperation Council, which, as you know, is a powerful group of Sunni royalist groups set up largely by the United States in the region. And they were talking about, obviously, the conflict in Syria, conflict in Yemen, and there's just a real feeling amongst the GCC, especially Saudi Arabia, that the US President Barack Obama has not done enough in Syria in terms of moving President Assad, which is a key goal of Riyadh, not backing rebels. And meanwhile, the US feels that Riyadh has not acted strongly enough against ISIL and is perhaps putting too much of its military arsenal into the civil war in Yemen without concentrating on terrorism as well. So,
right.
You know, a lot of big problems here.
There's also a development in Congress. There's a bill, that's the U.S. Congress, making its way through the Congress, the Justice Against Sponsors of Terrorism Act. There's also a 28-page congressional document on the September 11th terrorist attacks. It's actually 28 pages that were redacted, deleted. Right. Why do these developments concern Saudi Arabia so much?
Well, this goes back to 9/11. Let's take the 28 pages first. In that report that was released by Congress, 28 pages redacted, which are considered nationally sensitive to the US and Saudi Arabia. It was George W. Bush who first did that, and the Obama administration have kept those pages out. Now, while they do not, everyone says who's seen them, point to Saudi implicity when it comes to the attacks of 9/11. Everyone knows the majority of the hijackers of those planes were from Saudi Arabia, and they may have had help or funding from elements within Saudi Arabia who may be connected to the government or the Wahhabist organizations that actually do funnel money through government agencies, especially abroad. So that's tremendously embarrassing as well. And Saudi Arabia threatening to sell off US assets, US Treasury bonds. They have about $750 billion worth as well. So that would be tremendously embarrassing. So they see this as a loss of face. And this comes down to a real difference between the US and Saudi Arabia when, of course, it comes to religion. Saudi Arabia has a Wahhabist Sunni outlook, which doesn't fit well with the US democratic system, and it's always been a problem.
Okay, Nathan, thanks. That's CCTV's Nathan King reporting. Joining us now for more on the US-Saudi relationship, we're joined by former US Ambassador to Saudi Arabia, Robert Jordan. He's author of the book Desert Diplomat, Inside Saudi Arabia Following 9/11. Ambassador, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
What is your assessment of the current state of relations between the United States and Saudi Arabia? Is what we're seeing now just a bump on the road, or is there something more serious going on here?
Well, I think it's more than a bump on the road, but we've had these moments before. Remember the Arab oil embargo in 1973. We've had other incidents like this. So I think we'll probably survive it, but it is something that's serious, and I think it's something that needs a lot of attention on both sides.
The Saudis are unhappy with the United States for a variety of reasons. One of them is that there's a bill currently going through Congress which could see families of 9/11 victims hold Saudi Arabia legally responsible for those attacks. There's the Iran nuclear deal, which Saudi Arabia is unhappy about. There's questions over the U.S. commitment to the Middle East. President Obama was recently in Saudi Arabia. Was he able to placate the Saudis on these concerns?
No, I think it was quite telling that they had a press conference in which they did not really announce any kind of joint agreement. They simply said they had a very frank exchange of ideas. I suspect that's an understatement.
Was this about a renewed commitment to Arab issues on the part of President Obama, or was this him just saying goodbye and thanks for my 8 years in office?
Well, I think he's tried to show a renewed commitment, but it's been more talk than action. They had the meeting in Camp David. They had another meeting in Washington. I think King Salman has not been convinced of American willingness to really take the action that they keep promising. And so this was another installment in that episode, in that exchange of views. I do think, though, that by and large we have very common interests, and I think they did recognize that. We have an interest in fighting terrorism. We have an interest in a stable price of oil. We have an interest in making progress in the Muslim world, and certainly in fighting ISIS and the other terrorist elements. So there's a community of interest that I think probably goes beyond the differences that we have seen expressed.
And is this also a case of the U.S. priorities being elsewhere in the world right now? Its strategic interests, its security interests being in other places, not in the Middle East?
Well, I think that's the way this administration has pitched it, but I think they have ignored really some very important American vital interests in the course of this. They've walked away from Iraq. They have turned Libya upside down without any follow-through. So we've seen, I think the Saudis are very concerned that the Americans still have reason to be present, reason to play a leadership role, and they're not playing that role.
So in a sense, are the Saudis in some way justified at being angry with the United States right now?
Well, I think there is some reason for them to be concerned. You know, the old saying is just because you're paranoid doesn't mean someone's not out to get you. And I think there is reason behind some of their concerns. For example, the demise of Hosni Mubarak in Egypt. The Saudis saw that happen and saw this administration embraced the Muslim Brotherhood, and they said if this can happen to Mubarak, why can't it happen to us? I think they've seen the red line in Syria ignored, in addition to the items that you mentioned earlier. So I think there is a long list of grievances that, from a Saudi national interest standpoint, have some legitimacy.
Right, and those items that I was talking about, let's look at that bill that's currently making its way through Congress.
Yeah.
If it passes, if it becomes law, Saudi Arabia has threatened to sell off United States assets amounting to hundreds of billions of dollars. I mean, could there be serious damage here?
Well, I think that's probably more of a threat than a likely scenario. My guess is that bill will not go forward, and the president has threatened to veto it if it does. But I think the Saudis would probably be hurting themselves more than anyone by selling off those assets in the United States.
What about the Saudi aid for rebels who are fighting in Syria right now? It seems to work against United States interests, doesn't it? Because much of this aid ends up in the hands of groups like Islamic State.
Well, I don't know exactly about Islamic State. Certainly some ends up in the hands of al-Nusra, which is an al-Qaeda front, and so I think there is some reason for concern there. The Saudis are very frustrated that there has not been enough progress in fighting ISIS or the Bashar al-Assad regime in Syria, and I think they feel frustrated and are basically trying to find and cobble together any kind of coalition they can. I think it is dangerous for them to be supporting groups that we consider to be allies of al-Qaeda or allies of the Islamic State.
Do you think the relationship with Saudi Arabia could ever get back to what it used to be like?
I think there's a chance with leadership on both sides. Again, as I say, we have many common interests. Many Saudis still send their kids to be educated in the United States. They vacation here. I think one of the difficulties we have, of course, is the Saudi religious practices and some would say extremism propagated around the world that causes a lot of Americans to not have a particularly friendly view of of Saudi Arabia. But I think it's important for us to recognize these common interests and show the leadership that's necessary to get to know each other personally. There has not really been a personal connection between King Salman and the American leadership. I think the next president, whoever that is, has a chance of restoring that.
Is the broad relationship the United States has with the Middle East being seen very differently by the Saudis? The United States feels that it can be friends with Iran, it can also be friends with Saudi Arabia, and Saudi Arabia looks at it, you've got to be friends with us or them, not both of us.
Well, friends is probably the wrong word here. There are really no permanent friends and permanent enemies. You have mutual interests, and alliances can shift. I don't think right now there's really talk of being friends with Iran, certainly not at a time when they're sponsoring Hezbollah and Hamas, threatening Israel, our strong allies. So I think it's probably extreme to say we're looking to be friends with Iran. But we do have some common interest with Iran as well, and we want to see a stable Middle East. The Saudis, I think, are having a hard time, and this is something that we've just got to continue to work through.
And I'm just wondering whether we're reading too much into this. When I say we, I mean us in the media and perhaps others as well. Because when we look at what's being said about this relationship between the United States and Saudi Arabia, that's one thing. But when we look at the business deals that are being done, especially the arms sales to Saudi Arabia from the United States, it's still on a solid footing. The United States continues to sell billions of dollars worth of weapons to Saudi Arabia.
That's exactly right. We have about $96 billion worth of orders on the books right now. This is a very important element to segments of the American economy. It also is of very strategic importance because we have interoperability. They can operate with American forces. We train them. They come to the United States for further training and education. So this is the way alliances are built. And I think this is something that people do ignore. And I think it is an element of why this relationship is probably going to continue and will survive this impediment that we're seeing right now.
Right, but I guess right now it'll be very much in the hands of the next president, wouldn't it?
I think it will be. And I think getting to know each other, getting to know King Salman and whoever our president is, whoever the senior members of the administration are, is extremely important. This is a relationship that's been going on for over 70 years, and I don't think it's in anyone's best interest to simply turn our backs on them.
Ambassador Robert Jordan, thanks for joining us, sir.
Thank you.
Coming up, should the U.S. and Saudi Arabia cut ties altogether, or is there a better way forward? We're joined by a panel of experts. That's coming up next. Stay with us. You're watching The Heat. Welcome back. We're discussing the strained relationship between the United States and Saudi Arabia and the way forward for the country's strategic partnership. Join me now. Emma Ashford is a research fellow in defense and foreign policy at the Cato Institute, a DC-based think tank, and Abdul Latif Al-Mulhim is a former Saudi naval officer and current columnist for several Saudi newspapers. Thanks to both of you for joining us. Emma, let me start with you. Here we have two countries that have been very close allies since World War II, but in recent months we've seen these tensions rising in their relationship. What, in your view, is driving this?
So we've heard a lot of people talking over the last couple of months that the thing that is driving this tension in the US-Saudi relationship is that the US is pulling back from the Middle East, and that's the big problem. But actually, this is something that probably would have happened anyway. This is a result of much longer-term phenomena. The US and Saudi Arabia are diverging. Their strategic interests are diverging. We were very close during the Cold War. Today, we don't have that much in common. And so it's increasingly hard to find common ground.
To what extent does the United States nuclear deal with Iran, this current bill which is going through Congress right now, which could hold Saudi Arabia responsible for what happened on 9/11, to what extent do those things drive these strains?
They certainly don't help. And I think we can all agree that the Iranian nuclear deal, as a sign that the US is perhaps starting to consider some form of rapprochement with Iran, is not viewed favorably in Riyadh in any way. But as I say, I think the underlying problems in the US-Saudi relationship are much deeper. It's not just that this year there's the Iranian deal and the relationship has got bad. It's not just this congressional bill this month. It's that our interests are fundamentally diverging.
Abdul Latif, let me come to you, and let's look first at this law which is being considered in the US Congress. It's being called the Justice Against Sponsors of Terrorism Act, which will make it easier for families of 9/11 victims to sue foreign governments that they believe helped in the 9/11 attacks. Now, Saudi Arabia has been named in this regard. It has strongly denied these allegations, yet it's very angry over this law and has even threatened retaliation. It said it would sell off US assets if this bill is passed in Congress. So if Saudi Arabia has nothing to fear, why is it so angry about this law?
First of all, hello everybody in Washington, and hello to the other guest, Emma. First of all, the Saudis were caught by surprise because things came all of a sudden. The investigation, the official investigation into the 9/11 is a done deal, and Saudi Arabia was clear. We think that the Al-Qaeda had done what they had done. This horrible terrorist act in the United States was technically aimed at, against Saudi Arabia. They wanted to put Saudi Arabia on a collision course with the United States. But during the investigation, they didn't succeed. But every once in a while, the media would talk about, bringing back the name of Saudi Arabia. So I think this is one of the reasons.
Let me ask you, Abdul Latif, about the other point that Emma made, and that is that the strategic interests of the United States and Saudi Arabia have now diverged. They're not the same as they used to be.
Well, believe it or not, I always thought that they should be, the United States and Saudi Arabia should have been closer, especially after the Arab Spring. Because Saudi Arabia is a very, very strategic country, and it proved during the Arab Spring its strength and its ability to sustain all the shifting winds in the area. So the United States do need stable countries in the region, because this, at the end of the day, the stability of Saudi Arabia, a country like Saudi Arabia, is good for the area. But the United States really surprised everybody in the area when they technically gradually pulled from the area, and there is a big vacuum that is happening in the area at a very, very, very difficult time. And Saudi Arabia was successful in technically making the area more stable. I think Saudi Arabia should have or the United States should have been getting closer to Saudi Arabia rather than diverting their courses, going apart. One more point about the American actions is that it had a very, very drastic change in their relations with Iran. They came from putting blueprints for attacking Iran or their nuclear facilities to making deals with them, and all of a sudden the doors of Iran is fully open for the Americans, and the Americans are siding clearly with Iran. Even there was big standoff with the nuclear issue.
Emma, I want to get to some specifics here of what's going on in the Middle East. We look at the civil war that's taking place in Syria right now. Saudi Arabia and other Middle Eastern countries like Qatar have been supporting these rebel groups with money and with weapons. I want you to take a listen to what Vice President Joe Biden had to say about this.
Our biggest problem is our allies. Our allies in the region were our largest problem in Syria. The Saudis, the Emiratis, etc. What were they doing? They were so determined to take down Assad and essentially have a proxy Sunni-Shia war. What did they do? They poured hundreds of millions of dollars and thousands of tons of weapons into anyone who would fight against Assad, except that the people who were being supplied were al-Nusra and al-Qaeda and the extremist elements of jihadis coming from other parts of the world.
Now, I should say that he made that speech in 2014, but it's an unusual bit of candor, isn't it? on the relationship with those countries in the Middle East, especially with Saudi Arabia. He subsequently did apologize for what he said. But did he have a point there?
Absolutely. I think one of the best things about Joe Biden is sometimes he says things that are absolutely true, even if they're not politically correct. And in this case, he is correct. The idea that Saudi Arabia was instrumental in the Arab Spring because it was helping to promote stability throughout the region is actually entirely false. The Saudis may have tried to prevent some of the changes that erupted as a result of the Arab Spring, but what we see in a lot of countries, we see in Bahrain, where a largely peaceful uprising was brutally crushed by a GCC-led military force, and then we see in Syria where money and weapons and arms were poured into this conflict, almost definitely made it worse, almost definitely prolonged the conflict, and the result is the civil war and the rise of ISIS.
Abdul Latif, we just had President Obama in Saudi Arabia paying a visit to the country. What did he discuss with the Saudis, and what did the Saudis want from him? Did they get any reassurances that this relationship is still stable, is still solid?
I think they get assurances, but going to Biden's speech, why everybody is surprised that Saudi Arabia is trying to solve problems that are happening on its own borders. We saw the United States invading a country, which is Iraq, which is 7,000 miles away, because they thought there was a threat from Iraq to the United States. So what happened is during the, or even before the invasion of the American invasion of Iraq, we told the Americans that if you break it, you buy it. And we knew that the minute the Americans invaded Iraq, there will be a very big chaos in the Middle East, like a domino effect. And when people are concentrating in Syria, if the United States had a clearer vision or clearer decision, or Obama administration had a clearer vision on Syria, things would have been, you know, a lot better. Either you know, Bashar staying in power with some sort of arrangements, or simply you know, stepping aside. But you know, people in Syria got really scared when they saw things turn up into a chaos after the death of Muammar Gaddafi. Syria is not far away from Saudi Arabia. We are the one who's supposed to be worried, not you know, not the Americans, to be frank.
Emma, what about that view that the chaos that we see in the Middle East now, that was triggered off by the United States invasion of Iraq, and Saudi Arabia was there looking at what was going on and said, we have to bring this to an end, we have to maintain some kind of stability in this region?
I think perhaps people overstate how strongly the Saudis were opposed to the US invasion of Iraq, but this is something on which we completely agree. A lot of the chaos that we're seeing in the Middle East today is the result of the American invasion of Iraq, which helped to destabilize Iraq. We probably would not have seen the rise of ISIS inside the Syrian civil war if this had not happened. I'm not sure we can attribute the Arab Spring to the invasion of Iraq, but it all comes together to the situation where we do see a lot more chaos today. So certainly the Saudis have done nothing to improve the stability of the region. We haven't either.
Abdul Latif, has Saudi Arabia got to the point now where it's decided that the United States is not an ally it can trust, that it's a fair weather friend, and that Saudi Arabia must now form its own alliances with others, excluding the United States, perhaps countries with the same kind of religion as it has, the Sunni faith?
No, Saudi-American relation had been strong and will always be strong. The two countries do share a lot of common things, and the economy between the country is a lot more than what people think. And believe it or not, I do agree that maybe it's the Saudi fault that we didn't expose ourselves to the average American on the street. We talked to the people in the White House and the Congress or the big companies, but we never you know, talked to the average American to show him the importance of Saudi Arabia, or what Saudi Arabia meant to the you know, the American taxpayers. It's our duty to actually be involved in the you know, in the think tank or public relations in the United States to actually clarify a lot of things about Saudi Arabia that are being misunderstood, especially in the American media. This is why a lot of people in Saudi Arabia are so surprised to see very highly respected you know, American newspapers use very like technically uneducated, language or guesses or talk about a country like Saudi Arabia. But as far as the long-range relation between the two countries, you see more American products in Saudi Arabia than you would see in the American markets.
Emma, Abdul Latif has a point there. We hear all this rhetoric about the strained relationship between Saudi Arabia and the United States, yet the United States continues to sell billions of dollars worth of weapons to Saudi Arabia.
It's true. I think if we're going to talk about what interests we have in common, though, we have to ask what those interests really are. Certainly today, U.S. arms sales to Saudi Arabia are a big business concern for business leaders here in the U.S. But if we look at a lot of the other interests that we had in common, say 30, 40 years ago, we fought against the Soviets together, anti-communism, we were very concerned about energy security. A lot of those things have changed, and there's really no reason in the post-Cold War world, particularly today, for the U.S. to be so strongly aligned with Saudi Arabia when a policy of more pragmatic engagement with various countries in the region would probably produce better results.
Of course, the United States has also become self-sufficient in its oil needs.
Yes, and this is a big part of the change. So the rise of shale production inside the U.S. The U.S. is now one of the world's largest producers of oil and natural gas. And the fact that modern energy markets allow the market to respond to disruptions a lot more quickly than it used to, all of that means we're far less dependent on Middle Eastern oil than we used to be.
Right, Abdul Latif, you want to say something? I've just got a minute, please.
She said something about the Saudi-American relation. Whom should the United States be closer to in the Middle East if they are not getting, if they don't want to be close to Saudi Arabia?
Well, that's a logical fallacy, right? You're saying if we're not close to Saudi Arabia, we automatically have to be close to someone else. We have to, say, align with Iran. That's not actually the case. The U.S. can avoid having extremely close alliance ties with all the states in the Middle East, work pragmatically with different states as needed on different issues. We don't need to have specific formal alliances.
Okay, that is another story. We're going to have to leave it there. Thanks to both of you for joining us. That's all we have time for, but the conversation continues online. Chat with us about this or any other show on Twitter. We're at CCTV_America. We also use Facebook. Find us at facebook.com/CCTV America. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us.